Now that we are all fed and watered, said Hermione, I must once more ask for your attention while I give out a few notices. Mr. Filch, the caretaker, has asked me to tell you that the list of objects forbidden inside the castle has this year been extended to include screaming yo-yos, fanged frisbees, and ever-bashing boomerangs. The full list comprises some 437 items, I believe, and can be viewed in Mr. Filch's office if anybody would like to check it. The corners of Dumbledore's mouth twitched. He continued, As ever, I would like to remind you all that the forest on the grounds is out of bounds to students, as is the village of Hogsmeade to all below 3rd year. It is also my painful duty to inform you that the Inter-House Quidditch Cup will not take place this year. What? Harry gasped. He looked around at Fred and George, his fellow members of the Quidditch team. They were mouthing soundlessly at Dumbledore, apparently too appalled to speak. Dumbledore went on. This is due to an event that will be starting in October and continuing throughout the school year, taking up much of the teachers' time and energy. But I'm sure you will all enjoy it immensely. I have great pleasure in announcing that this year at Hogwarts... But at that moment, there was a deafening rumble of thunder and the doors of the great hall banged open. A man stood in the doorway, leaning upon a long staff, shrouded in a black traveling cloak. Every head in the great hall swiveled toward the stranger, suddenly brightly illuminated by a fork of lightning that flashed across the ceiling. He lowered his hood, shook out a long mane of grizzled, dark grey hair, then began to walk up toward the teacher's table. A dull clunk echoed through the hall on his every other step. He reached the end of the top table, turned right, and limped heavily toward Dumbledore. Another flash of lightning crossed the ceiling. Hermione gasped. The lightning had thrown the man's face into sharp relief, and it was a face unlike any Harry had ever seen. It looked as though it had been carved out of weathered wood by someone who had only the vaguest idea of what human faces are supposed to look like, and was none too skilled with a chisel. Every inch of skin seemed to be scarred. The mouth looked like a diagonal gash, and a large chunk of the nose was missing. But it was the man's eyes that made him frightening. One of them was small, dark, and beady. The other was large, round as a coin, and a vivid electric blue. The blue eye was moving ceaselessly without blinking, and was rolling up, down, and from side to side, quite independently of the normal eye. And then it rolled right over, pointing into the back of the man's head, so that all they could see was whiteness. The stranger reached Dumbledore. He stretched out a hand that was as badly scarred as his face, and Dumbledore shook it, muttering words Harry couldn't hear. He seemed to be making some inquiry of the stranger, who shook his head unsmilingly and replied in an undertone. Dumbledore nodded and gestured the man to the empty seat on his right-hand side. The stranger sat down, shook his mane of dark grey hair out of his face, pulled a plate of sausages toward him, raised it to what was left of his nose, and sniffed it. He then took a small knife out of his pocket, speared a sausage on the end of it, and began to eat. His normal eye was fixed upon the sausages, but the blue eye was still darting restlessly around in its socket, taking in the hall and the students. May I introduce our new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, said Dumbledore brightly into the silence, Professor Moody. It was usual for new staff members to be greeted with applause, but none of the staff or students clapped except Dumbledore and Hagrid, who both put their hands together and applauded. But the sound echoed dismally into the silence, and they stopped fairly quickly. Everyone else seemed too transfixed by Moody's bizarre appearance to do more than stare at him. Moody? Harry muttered to Ron. Mad-Eye Moody? The one your dad went to help this morning? Must be, said Ron in a low, awed voice. What happened to him? Hermione whispered. What happened to his face? Dunno, Ron whispered back, watching Moody with fascination. Moody seemed totally indifferent to his less-than-warm welcome. Ignoring the jug of pumpkin juice in front of him, he reached again into his traveling cloak, pulled out a hip flask, and took a long draught from it. As he lifted his arm to drink, his cloak was pulled a few inches from the ground, and Harry saw, below the table, several inches of carved wooden leg, ending in a clawed foot. Dumbledore cleared his throat. As I was saying, he said, smiling at the sea of students before him, all of whom were still gazing transfixed at Mad-Eye Moody. We are to have the honor of hosting a very exciting event over the coming months. An event that has not been held for over a century. It is my very great pleasure to inform you that the Triwizard Tournament will be taking place at Hogwarts this year. You're joking, said Fred Weasley loudly. The tension that had filled the hall ever since Moody's arrival suddenly broke. Nearly everyone laughed, and Dumbledore chuckled appreciatively. I am not joking, Mr. Weasley, he said. Though now that you mention it, I did hear an excellent one over the summer about a troll, a hag, and a leprechaun who all go into a bar. Professor McGonagall cleared her throat loudly. But maybe this is not the time. No, said Dumbledore. Where was I? Ah, yes. The Triwizard Tournament. Well, some of you will not know what this tournament involves. So I hope those who do know will forgive me for giving a short explanation and allow their attention to wander freely. The Triwizard Tournament was first established some 700 years ago as a friendly competition between the three largest European schools of wizardry, Hogwarts, Beauxbaton, and Durmstrang. A champion was selected to represent each school, and the three champions competed in three magical tasks. The schools took it in turns to host the tournament once every 5 years, and it was generally agreed to be a most excellent way of establishing ties between young witches and wizards of different nationalities, until, that is, the death toll mounted so high that the tournament was discontinued. Death toll? Hermione whispered, looking alarmed. But her anxiety did not seem to be shared by the majority of students in the hall. Many of them were whispering excitedly to one another, and Harry himself was far more interested in hearing about the tournament than in worrying about deaths that had happened hundreds of years ago. There have been several attempts over the centuries to reinstate the tournament, Dumbledore continued, none of which has been very successful. However, our own departments of international magical cooperation and magical games and sports have decided the time is ripe for another attempt. We have worked hard over the summer to ensure that this time no champion will find himself or herself in mortal danger. The heads of Beauxbaton and Durmstrang will be arriving with their short-listed contenders in October, and the selection of the three champions will take place at Halloween. An impartial judge will decide which students are most worthy to compete for the Triwizard Cup, the glory of their school, and 1,000 galleons personal prize money. I'm going for it, Fred Weasley hissed down the table, his face lit with enthusiasm at the prospect of such glory and riches. He was not the only person who seemed to be visualizing himself as the Hogwarts champion. At every house table, Harry could see people either gazing raptly at Dumbledore or else whispering fervently to their neighbors. But then Dumbledore spoke again, and the hall quieted once more. Eager though I know all of you will be to bring the Triwizard Cup to Hogwarts, he said, the heads of the participating schools, along with the Ministry of Magic, have agreed to impose an age restriction on contenders this year. Only students who are of age, that is to say 17 years or older, will be allowed to put forward their names for consideration. This, Dumbledore raised his voice slightly, for several people had made noises of outrage at these words, and the Weasley twins were suddenly looking furious, is a measure we feel is necessary, given that the tournament tasks will still be difficult and dangerous, whatever precautions we take, and it is highly unlikely that students below 6th and 7th year will be able to cope with them. I will personally be ensuring that no underage student hoodwinks our impartial judge into making them Hogwarts champion. His light blue eyes twinkled as they flickered over Fred's and George's mutinous faces. I therefore beg you not to waste your time submitting yourself if you are under 17. The delegations from Beauxbatons and Durmstrang will be arriving in October and remaining with us for the greater part of this year. I know that you will all extend every courtesy to our foreign guests while they are with us, and will give your wholehearted support to the Hogwarts champion when he or she is selected. And now it is late, and I know how important it is to you all to be alert and rested as you enter your lessons tomorrow morning. Bedtime, chop chop. Dumbledore sat down again and turned to talk to Mad-Eye Moody. There was a great scraping and banging as all the students got to their feet and swarmed toward the double doors into the entrance hall. They can't do that, said George Weasley, who had not joined the crowd moving toward the door, but was standing up and glaring at Dumbledore. We're 17 in April, why can't we have a shot? They're not stopping me entering, said Fred stubbornly, also scowling at the top table. The champions will get to do all sorts of stuff you'd never be allowed to do normally, and 1,000 galleons prize money. Yeah, said Ron, a faraway look on his face. Yeah, 1,000 galleons. Come on, said Hermione. We'll be the only ones left here if you don't move. Harry, Ron, Hermione, Fred and George set off for the entrance hall, Fred and George debating the ways in which Dumbledore might stop those who were under 17 from entering the tournament. Who's this impartial judge who's going to decide who the champions are? Said Harry. Dunno, said Fred, but it's them we'll have to fool. I reckon a couple of drops of aging potion might do it, George. Dumbledore knows you're not of age, though, said Ron. Yeah, but he's not the one who decides who the champion is he? Said Fred shrewdly. Sounds to me like once this judge knows who wants to enter, he'll choose the best from each school and never mind how old they are. Dumbledore's trying to stop us giving our names. People have died, though, said Hermione in a worried voice as they walked through a door concealed behind a tapestry and started up another narrower staircase. Yeah, said Fred airily, but that was years ago, wasn't it? Anyway, where's the fun without a bit of risk? Hey, Ron, what if we find out how to get round Dumbledore? Fancy entering? What do you reckon? Ron asked Harry. Be cool to enter, wouldn't it? But I suppose they might want someone older. Don't know if we've learned enough. I definitely haven't, came Neville's gloomy voice from behind Fred and George. I expect my gran would want me to try, though. She's always going on about how I should be upholding the family honour. I'll just have to... Whoops! Neville's foot had sunk right through a step halfway up the staircase. There were many of these trick stairs at Hogwarts. It was second nature to most of the older students to jump this particular step, but Neville's memory was notoriously poor. Harry and Ron seized him under the armpits and pulled him out, while a suit of armour at the top of the stairs creaked and clanked, laughing wheezily. Shut it, you, said Ron, banging down its visor as they passed. They made their way up to the entrance to Gryffindor Tower, which was concealed behind a large portrait of a fat lady in a pink silk dress. Password, she said as they approached. Balderdash, said George. A prefect downstairs told me. The portrait swung forward to reveal a hole in the wall through which they all climbed. A crackling fire warmed the circular common room, which was full of squashy armchairs and tables. Hermione cast the merrily dancing flames a dark look, and Harry distinctly heard her mutter, "Slave labour," before bidding them good night and disappearing through the doorway to the girls' dormitory. Harry Harry, Ron and Neville climbed up the last spiral staircase until they reached their own dormitory, which was situated at the top of the tower. 5 four-poster beds with deep crimson hangings stood against the walls, each with its owner's trunk at the foot. Dean and Seamus were already getting into bed. Seamus had pinned his iron rosette to his headboard, and Dean had tacked up a poster of Victor Crumb over his bedside table. His old poster of the West Ham football team was pinned right next to it. Men outside, shaking his head at the completely stationary soccer players. Harry, Ron and Neville got into their pajamas and into bed. Someone, a house elf, no doubt, had placed warming pads between the sheets. It was extremely comfortable lying there in bed and listening to the storm raging outside. I might go in for it, you know, Ron said sleepily through the darkness. If Fred and George find out how to... A tournament? You never know, do you? Suppose not. Harry rolled over in bed, a series of dazzling new pictures forming in his mind's eye. He had hoodwinked the impartial judge into believing he was 17. He had become Hogwarts champion. He was standing on the grounds, his arms raised in triumph in front of the whole school, all of whom were applauding and screaming. He had just won the Triwizard Tournament. Cho's face stood out particularly clearly in the blurred crowd, her face glowing with admiration. Harry grinned into his pillow, exceptionally glad that Ron couldn't see what he could. Chapter 13. Mad-Eye Moody. The storm had blown itself out by the following morning, though the ceiling in the great hall was still gloomy. Heavy clouds of pewter grey swirled overhead as Harry, Ron and Hermione examined their new course schedules at breakfast. A few seats along, Fred, George and Lee Jordan were discussing magical methods of aging themselves and bluffing their way into the Triwizard Tournament. Today's not bad. Outside all morning, said Ron, who was running his finger down the Monday column of his schedule. Herbology with the Hufflepuffs and care of magical creatures. Damn it, we're still with the Slytherins. Double divination this afternoon, Harry groaned, looking down. Divination was his least favorite subject, apart from potions. Professor Trelawney kept predicting Harry's death, which he found extremely annoying. You should have given it up like me, shouldn't you? Said Hermione briskly, buttering herself some toast. Then you'd be doing something sensible like arithmancy. You're eating again, I notice, said Ron, watching Hermione adding liberal amounts of jam to her toast too. I've decided there are better ways of making a stand about elf rights, said Hermione haughtily. Yeah, and you were hungry, said Ron, grinning. There was a sudden rustling noise above them, and 100 owls came soaring through the open windows, carrying the morning mail. Instinctively, Harry looked up, but there was no...
For help with that, first you'll need to allow personal results in this car. When it's safe, you can go ahead and make the change in assistant settings.
Looked up, but there was no sign of white among the massive brown and grey. The owls circled the tables, looking for the people to whom their letters and packages were addressed. A large tawny owl soared down to Neville Longbottom and deposited a parcel into his lap. Neville almost always forgot to pack something. On the other side of the hall, Draco Malfoy's eagle owl had landed on his shoulder, carrying what looked like his usual supply of sweets and cakes from home. Trying to ignore the sinking feeling of disappointment in his stomach, Harry returned to his porridge. Was it possible that something had happened to Hedwig, and that Sirius hadn't even got his letter? His preoccupation lasted all the way across the sop and vegetable patch until they arrived in Greenhouse 3. But here he was distracted by Professor Sprout, showing the class the ugliest plants Harry had ever seen. Indeed, they looked less like plants than thick, black giant slugs, protruding vertically out of the soil. Each was squirming slightly, and had a number of large, shiny swellings upon it, which appeared to be full of liquid. Uber-tubers, Professor Sprout told them briskly. They need squeezing. You will collect the pus. The what? said Seamus Finnegan, sounding revolted.
Pus, Finnegan, pus, said Professor Sprout. And it's extremely valuable, so don't waste it. You will collect the pus, I say, in these bottles. Wear your dragonhide gloves. It can do funny things to the skin when undiluted. Booba-tuba pus.
Squeezing the bubo-tubers was disgusting, but oddly satisfying. As each swelling was popped, a large amount of thick, yellowish-green liquid burst forth, which smelled strongly of petrol. They caught it in the bottles, as Professor Sprout had indicated, and by the end of the lesson had collected several pints.
This'll keep Madame Pomfrey happy, said Professor Sprout, stopping the last bottle with a cork. An excellent remedy for the more stubborn forms of acne. Booba-tuba pus should stop students resorting to desperate measures to rid themselves of pimples. Like poor Eloise Mitchell, said Hannah Abbott, a Hufflepuff, in a hushed voice. She tried to curse herself. Silly girl, said Professor Sprout, shaking her head. But Madame Pomfrey fixed her nose back on in the end.
A booming bell echoed from the castle across the wet grounds, signalling the end of the lesson, and the class separated. The Hufflepuffs climbing the stone steps for transfiguration, and the Gryffindors heading in the other direction, down the sloping lawn toward Hagrid's small wooden cabin, which stood on the edge of the Forbidden Forest. Hagrid was standing outside his hut, one hand on the collar of his enormous black boarhound, Fang. There were several open wooden crates on the ground at his feet, and Fang was whimpering and straining at his collar, apparently keen to investigate the contents more closely. As they drew nearer, an odd rattling noise reached their ears, punctuated by what sounded like minor explosions.
Morning,
Hagrid said, grinning at Harry, Ron, and Hermione.
Better wait for the Slytherins. They won't want to miss this. Blast-ended scroots.
Come again, said Ron. Hagrid pointed down into the crates.
Ugh!
Squealed Lavender Brown, jumping backward.
Ugh!
Just about summed up the blast-ended scroots, in Harry's opinion. They looked like deformed, shellless lobsters, horribly pale and slimy-looking, with legs sticking out in very odd places, and no visible heads. There were about 100 of them in each crate, each about 6 inches long, crawling over one another, bumping blindly into the sides of the boxes. They were giving off a very powerful smell of rotting fish. Every now and then, sparks would fly out of the end of a scroot, and with a small thud, it would be propelled forward several inches.
Only just hatched,
said Hagrid proudly.
So you'll be able to raise them yourselves. Thought we'd make a bit of a project of it.
And why would we want to raise them? Said a cold voice. The Slytherins had arrived. The speaker was Draco Malfoy. Crabbe and Goyle were chuckling appreciatively at his words. Hagrid looked stumped at the question. I mean, what do they do? Asked Malfoy. What is the point of them? Hagrid opened his mouth, apparently thinking hard. There was a few seconds' pause. Then he said roughly,
That's next lesson, Malfoy. You're just feeding them today. Now, you'll want to try them on a few different things. I've never had them before. Not sure what they'll go for. I got ant eggs and frog livers and a bit of grass snake. Just try them out with a bit of each.
First pus, now this,
muttered Seamus. Nothing but deep affection for Hagrid could have made Harry, Ron, and Hermione pick up squelchy handfuls of frog liver and lower them into the crates to tempt the blast-ended scroots. Harry couldn't suppress the suspicion that the whole thing was entirely pointless, because the scroots didn't seem to have mouths.
Ouch!
Yelled Dean Thomas after about 10 minutes.
It got me.
Hagrid hurried over to him, looking anxious.
Its end exploded,
said Dean angrily, showing Hagrid a burn on his hand.
Ah, yeah, that can happen when they blast off,
said Hagrid, nodding.
Oh,
said Lavender Brown again.
oh, Hagrid, what's that pointy thing on it?
Ah, some of them have got stings,
said Hagrid enthusiastically. Lavender quickly withdrew her hand from the box.
I reckon they're the males. The females have got sort of sucker things on their bellies. I think they might be to suck blood.
Well, I can certainly see why we're trying to keep them alive, said Malfoy sarcastically. Who wouldn't want pets that can burn, sting, and bite all at once?
Just because they're not very pretty, it doesn't mean they're not useful,
Hermione snapped.
Dragon blood's amazingly magical, but you wouldn't want a dragon for a pet, would you?
Harry and Ron grinned at Hagrid, who gave them a furtive smile from behind his bushy beard. Hagrid would have liked nothing better than a pet dragon, as Harry, Ron, and Hermione knew only too well. He had owned one for a brief period during their first year, a vicious Norwegian ridgeback by the name of Norbert. Hagrid simply loved monstrous creatures. The more lethal, the better. Well, at least the Scroots are small, said Ron as they made their way back up to the castle for lunch an hour later.
They are now,
said Hermione in an exasperated voice,
but once Hagrid's found out what they eat, I expect they'll be 6 feet long.
Well, that won't matter if they turn out to cure seasickness or something, will it? Said Ron, grinning slyly at her.
You know perfectly well I only said that to shut Malfoy up,
said Hermione.
As a matter of fact, I think he's right. The best thing to do would be to stamp on the lot of them before they start attacking us all.
They sat down at the Gryffindor table and helped themselves to lamb chops and potatoes. Hermione began to eat so fast that Harry and Ron stared at her. Is this the new stand on elf rights? Said Ron. You're going to make yourself puke instead?
No,
said Hermione, with as much dignity as she could muster with her mouth bulging with sprouts.
I just want to get to the library.
What? Said Ron in disbelief. Hermione, it's the first day back. We haven't even got homework yet. Hermione shrugged and continued to shovel down her food as though she had not eaten for days. Then she leapt to her feet, said, "See you dinner," and departed at high speed. When the bell rang to signal the start of afternoon lessons, Harry and Ron set off for North Tower, where, at the top of a tightly spiraling staircase, a silver stepladder led to a circular trapdoor in the ceiling and the room where Professor Trelawney lived. The familiar sweet perfume spreading from the fire met their nostrils as they emerged at the top of the stepladder. As ever, the curtains were all closed. The circular room was bathed in a dim reddish light cast by the many lamps, which were all draped with scarves and shawls. Harry and Ron walked through the mass of occupied chintz chairs and puffs that cluttered the room, and sat down at the same small circular table. "Good day," said the misty voice of Professor Trelawney right behind Harry, making him jump. A very thin woman with enormous glasses that made her eyes appear far too large for her face. Professor Trelawney was peering down at Harry with the tragic expression she always wore whenever she saw him. The usual large amount of beads, chains, and bangles glittered upon her person in the firelight. "You are preoccupied, my dear," she said mournfully to Harry. "My inner eye sees past your brave face to the troubled soul within, and I regret to say that your worries are not baseless. I see difficult times ahead for you, alas, most difficult. I fear the thing you dread will indeed come to pass, and perhaps sooner than you had thought." Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. Ron rolled his eyes at Harry, who looked stonily back. Professor Trelawney swept past them and seated herself in a large winged armchair before the fire facing the class. Lavender Brown and Parvati Patil, who deeply admired Professor Trelawney, were sitting on poofs very close to her. "My dears, it is time for us to consider the stars," she said. "The movements of the planets and the mysterious portals they reveal only to those who understand the steps of the celestial dance. Human destiny may be deciphered by the planetary rays which intermingle." But Harry's thoughts had drifted. The perfumed fire always made him feel sleepy and dull-witted, and Professor Trelawney's rambling talks on fortune-telling never held him exactly spellbound, though he couldn't help thinking about what she had just said to him. "I fear the thing you dread will indeed come to pass." But Hermione was right. Harry thought house was staring at him. He sat up straight. He had been almost dozing off, lost in the heat and his thoughts.
I was saying, my dear, that you were clearly born under the baleful influence of Saturn,
said Professor Trelawney, a faint note of resentment in her voice at the fact that he had obviously not been hanging on her words.
Born under what? Sorry,
said Harry.
Saturn, dear, the planet Saturn,
said Professor Trelawney, sounding definitely irritated that he wasn't riveted by this news.
I was saying that Saturn was surely in a position of power in the heavens at the moment of your birth. Your dark hair, your mean stature, tragic losses so young in life. I think I'm right in saying, my dear, that you were born in midwinter.
No, said Harry. I was born in July. Ron hastily turned his laugh into a hacking cough. Half an hour later, each of them had been given a complicated circular chart and was attempting to fill in the position of the planets at their moment of birth. It was dull work, requiring much consultation of timetables and calculation of angles.
I've got 2 Neptunes here,
said Harry after a while, frowning down at his piece of parchment.
That can't be right, can it?
Said Ron, imitating Professor Trelawney's mystical whisper.
When 2 Neptunes appear in the sky, it is a sure sign that a midget in glasses is being born, Harry.
Seamus and Dean, who were working nearby, sniggered loudly, though not loudly enough to mask the excited squeals from Lavender Brown.
Oh, Professor, look! I think I've got an unaspected planet. Oh, which one's that, Professor? It is Uranus, my dear,
said Professor Trelawney, peering down at the chart. Can I have a look at Uranus, too, Lavender? Said Ron. Most unfortunately, Professor Trelawney heard him, and it was this, perhaps, that made her give them so much homework at the end of the class.
A detailed analysis of the way the planetary movements in the coming month will affect you with reference to your personal chart,
she snapped, sounding much more like Professor McGonagall than her usual airy-fairy self.
I want it ready to hand in next Monday, and no excuses.
Miserable old bat, said Ron bitterly as they joined the crowds descending the staircases back to the great hall of dinner.
That'll take all weekend, that will. Lots of homework,
said Hermione brightly, catching up with them.
Professor Vector didn't give us any at all.
Well, bully for Professor Vector, said Ron moodily. They reached the entrance hall, which was packed with people queuing for dinner. They had just joined the end of the line when a loud voice ran out behind them.
Weasley! Hey, Weasley!
Harry, Ron and Hermione turned. Malfoy, Crabbe and Goyle were standing there, each looking thoroughly pleased about something. What? Said Ron shortly. Your dad's in the paper, Weasley, said Malfoy, brandishing a copy of the Daily Prophet and speaking very loudly so that everyone in the packed entrance hall could hear. Listen to this. Further mistakes at the Ministry of Magic. It seems as though the Ministry of Magic's troubles are not yet at an end, writes Rita Skeeter, special correspondent. Recently under fire for its poor crowd control at the Quidditch World Cup and still unable to account for the disappearance of one of its witches, the Ministry was plunged into fresh embarrassment yesterday by the antics of Arnold Weasley of the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts Office. Malfoy looked up. Imagine them not even getting his name right, Weasley. It's almost as though he's a complete non-entity, isn't it? He crowed. Everyone in the entrance hall was listening now. Malfoy straightened the paper with a flourish and read on. Arnold Weasley, who was charged with possession of a flying car 2 years ago, was yesterday involved in a tussle with several Muggle lawkeepers, policemen, over a number of highly aggressive dustbins. Mr. Weasley appeared to have rushed to the aid of Mad-Eye Moody, the aged ex-Auror, who retired from the Ministry when no longer able to tell the difference between a handshake and attempted murder. Unsurprisingly, Mr. Weasley found upon arrival at Mr. Moody's heavily guarded house that Mr. Moody had once again raised a false alarm. Mr. Weasley was forced to modify several memories before he could escape from the policeman, but refused to answer Daily Prophet questions about why he had involved the Ministry in such an undignified and potentially embarrassing scene. "And there's a picture, Weasley," said Malfoy, flipping the paper over and holding it up. "A picture of your parents outside their house, if you can call it a house. Your mother could do with losing a bit of weight, couldn't she?" Ron was shaking with fury. Everyone was staring at him. "Get stuffed, Malfoy," said Harry. "Come on, Ron." "Oh, yeah, you were staying with them this summer, weren't you, Potter?" sneered Malfoy. "So tell me, is his mother really that porky, or is it just the picture?" "You know your mother, Malfoy," said Harry. Both he and Hermione had grabbed the back of Ron's robes to stop him from launching himself at Malfoy. "That expression she's got, like she's got dung under her nose. Has she always looked like that, or was it just because you were with her?" Malfoy's pale face went slightly pink. "Don't you dare insult my mother, Potter." "Keep your fat mouth shut, then," said Harry, turning away. Bang! Several people screamed. Harry felt something white hot graze the side of his face. He plunged his hand into his robes for his wand, but before he'd even touched it, he heard a second loud bang and a roar that echoed through the entrance hall. "Oh, no, you don't, bloody!" Harry spun around. Professor Moody was limping down the marble staircase. His wand was out, and it was pointing right at a pure white ferret, which was shivering on the stone-flagged floor, exactly where Malfoy had been standing. There was a terrified silence in the entrance hall. Nobody but Moody was moving a muscle. Moody turned to look at Harry. At least his normal eye was looking at Harry. The other one was pointing into the back of his head. "Did he get you?" Moody growled. His voice was low and gravelly. "No," said Harry. "Missed." "Leave it!" Moody shouted. "Leave what?" Harry said, bewildered. "Not you. Him." Moody growled, jerking his thumb over his shoulder at Crabbe, who had just frozen, about to pick up the white ferret. It seemed that Moody's rolling eye was magical and could see out of the back of his head. Moody started to limp toward Crabbe, Goyle, and the ferret, which gave a terrified squeak and took off, streaking toward the dungeons. "I don't think so," roared Moody, pointing his wand at the ferret again. It flew 10 feet into the air, fell with a smack to the floor, and then bounced up once more. "I don't like people who attack when their opponent's back's turned," growled Moody, as the ferret bounced higher and higher, squealing in pain. "Stinking, cowardly, scummy thing to do." The ferret flew through the air, its legs and tail flailing helplessly. "Never do that again," said Moody, speaking each word as the ferret hit the stone floor and bounced upward again. "Professor Moody," said a shocked voice. Professor McGonagall was coming down the marble staircase with her arms full of books. "Hello, Professor McGonagall," said Moody calmly, bouncing the ferret still higher. What are you doing?" said Professor McGonagall, her eyes following the bouncing ferret's progress through the air. "Teaching," said Moody. "Teach? Moody! Is that a student?" shrieked Professor McGonagall, the book spilling out of her arms. "Yep," said Moody. "No!" cried Professor McGonagall, running down the stairs and pulling out her wand. A moment later, with a loud snapping noise, Draco Malfoy had reappeared, lying in a heap on the floor, with his sleek blonde hair all over his now brilliantly pink face. He got to his feet, wincing. "Moody, we never used transfiguration as a punishment," said Professor McGonagall weakly.